at 1:45 p.m. Eastern Time at the direction of President Biden. U.S. officials say it was flying off Alaska's northern coast at an altitude of 40,000 feet and was approximately the size of a small car. But as of now, the administration is not offering many more details than that.
We're calling this an object because that's the best description we have right now. We do not know who owns it, whether it's state-owned or corporate-owned or privately owned. We just don't know.
The context, of course, is crucial. Last Saturday, less than a week ago, the U.S. military shot down what the Biden administration says was a Chinese surveillance balloon. They did this off the coast of the United States after it had traveled across the entire United States. We are covering this breaking news from every angle. We're going to start with CNN's Phil Mattingly at the White House. Phil, President Biden just addressed this issue. What did he have to say?
Yeah, Jake, the president was waiting on the South Lawn for the arrival of Brazilian President Lula da Silva, and he was asked by our colleague DJ Judd if he had comment on the shoot down of this object. He called it a success. Didn't say anything further than that. And I think in part it's because there's still a significant number of outstanding questions. But the timeline here is important. The broader timeline is 6 days ago, U.S. fighters shot down the Chinese surveillance balloon. This is very much a different object in terms of how it's been described on size, on capabilities, what it actually has in the object itself. But last night, the U.S. became aware of the existence of this object. Late yesterday evening, fighter jets were sent up to actually kind of basically view the object, try and get a sense of what it actually was. It was not responsive. They determined it was unmanned, but they did not get a lot of information because it was in the evening. They were sent up again this morning to try and get a better sense of what the object actually was. After that effort by the two U.S. fighter jets, the president, who had been briefed on Thursday night, the recommendation was given to the president by the Pentagon that they should shoot the object down. Given the lack of information, given the lack of responsiveness, the president ordered the shoot down of the object, and at 1:45 p.m. that object was shot down. Recovery efforts are now underway. They believe that it landed in the Arctic Ocean, which is currently frozen, so that process is underway right now, but still a significant number of questions, and obviously a very different approach than we saw with the Chinese spy balloon. One thing officials have made clear, though, they saw no indication of any military risk to U.S. civilians from this object itself, but clearly moved to action very quickly, Jake.
Natasha Bertrand, let me bring you in. What happens next in terms of the investigation and in terms of all this debris that now exists?
Yeah, Jake, so what we were told by both the White House and by the Pentagon just then is that debris is kind of sitting on frozen waters in U.S. territorial waters and just kind of waiting to be picked up now. U.S. Army helicopters have been launched as part of this recovery effort, and ultimately when they are able to kind of pick up that debris, it will likely go through very much the same process that we are seeing taking place now with the Chinese balloon. It will likely go to an FBI lab in Quantico, Virginia to be analyzed, and they will have to see whether there is anything significant in terms of an intelligence capability that the U.S. could potentially gather on, but it remains unclear, of course, whether or not this is actually something that is significant in terms of the U.S.'s capability to collect intelligence on it, because it apparently was not transmitting at the time that it was shot down. But ultimately, the U.S. decided that this was the right call because it posed a threat to civilian aircraft. And moving forward, I think they are going to try to do this in a faster way because there is not the complication that we saw with the Chinese balloon in terms of it being underwater. This is kind of sitting on top of the surface, and the U.S. has been able to launch that recovery effort already. It is also, we should note, very small. It is only the size of a small car, not the size of 3 buses as we saw with the Chinese balloon. And the payload, that's that part of the object that actually carries the key equipment there, it is also very small. So this should not be an overly complicated recovery effort, but of course we'll have to see how it goes.
Kylie Atwood at the State Department. We can't ignore, obviously, the context less than a week after the U.S. shot down a Chinese spy balloon. How big a deal could this end up being? And is there any determination as of now whether this was Chinese as well?
Well, it is really hard to tell at this point how big of a deal this incident will be in comparison to the Chinese spy balloon. I think we can say that as of now, they really just don't know if this is a Chinese object. If it were to be, that would definitely inflame U.S.-China tensions even more. But U.S. officials are saying they don't know who is responsible for this, if it's a state-owned actor or if it's a private actor. And we are expecting, however, that there's going to be some confrontation between the United States and whomever is responsible for this object going into U.S. airspace once they figure out who that person or who that entity actually is. What's becoming clear, Jake, however, given the context of what's happened over the last week, is that the Biden administration, the U.S. government, is treating U.S. airspace with incredibly intense vigilance right now. And the question going forward is, what does that policy look like when any kind of unidentified objects comes into the U.S. airspace? Are they going to shoot it down immediately? There's a lot of questions going forward here.
And Natasha, how high was this object flying? Because it was lower than the Chinese balloon, right, which was around 60,000 feet in the air?
Pretty substantially lower. So this object was flying around 40,000 feet, which is about the top end of what civilian aircraft would fly at. The Chinese balloon was flying at 65,000 feet, so it did not pose as much of a risk to civilian aircraft. There was a notice to flights around the Chinese spy balloon when it was being shot down, of course, to avoid the airspace. But in this case, the really big concern here was that it was flying really at the same altitude or just above where civilian aircraft would fly. And President Biden apparently thought that was a risk that was just he was not willing to take, Jake.
All right, Natasha, Kylie, Phil, thanks so much on this breaking news story. Joining us to discuss, Republican Congressman Mike Waltz of Florida. He's on the Intelligence Committee, the Armed Services Committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, and he's a former Green Beret who served in the U.S. Army for more than 2 decades. So, Congressman, what's your reaction to hearing this object was just shot out of the sky just a couple hours ago?
Well, Jake, I think it's going to continue to beg, more policy questions. Okay, so this one was at 40,000 feet. The president determined it was a safety of flight risk. Does that then imply if this one had been at 65,000 feet, like the first balloon, we would have let it continue to traverse into Canada and possibly the United States? Is that the new criteria now? Is some type of interference with civilian aircraft? So that's kind of question one. I still have the question, if it had not been for some enterprising photographers in Montana, whether we would be taking this more decisive action at all. Was it really the kind of the public outcry, the violation of our sovereignty and airspace that's driving this change in policy? And then finally, Jake, I think the big outstanding question is why, if this was yet another Chinese balloon, why is she deciding to do this now? Right on the heels of his meeting with Biden. There was kind of an attempt for a reset button there in the relationship. Obviously, Blinken's canceled his trip, and yet they're either going to double down or the Chinese military is making moves that their leadership weren't fully apprised of. Either way, that's incredibly disturbing, and we just have more and more questions.
Well, what do you think the policy should be?
Well, look, I think a violation of our airspace by an entity that can surveil, that can gather information that can be used to inflict harm in the future, shouldn't be tolerated, should be shot down. And I think what's been left out of the discussion, Jake, is the message that it sends to our adversaries by not doing so. And we still have a lot to learn, but it could have been that the Chinese, once they got away with it for the last several years, believed that they could get away with it again. It turns out they did. We still have yet to learn what they collected with that first one that hovered over not just our missiles, but one of our stealth bomber bases and the strategic command responsible for all command and control over all of our nuclear arsenal. That's incredibly significant. We want to know what was transmitted back real time. What were they able to collect? We'll see, what we do with the forensics, but I'm glad at least now we're taking action on the West Coast before it enters, rather than waiting till the spy craft is done spying.
You said we should shoot down, the U.S. military should shoot down any surveillance aircraft. Is that regardless if it's manned or unmanned?
Well, I think that's a great question. And in our rules of engagement, I do think so. If it's entering our airspace and we deem it's going to be again, if it's going to collect significant intelligence that could harm us in the future, I think that should fit the criteria, and we need to make that red line well known to our adversaries.
CNN's Oren Lieberman just asked the Pentagon press secretary about the decision to shoot the object down. I want to play that exchange and get your reaction.
The decision to shoot it down before it entered too far into the U.S. airspace, the Pentagon bowing to political pressure from the Hill?
Look, again, we're going to judge each of these objects on its own merits. It entered into U.S. airspace on February 9th. We sent up aircraft to assess what it was. The decision was made that it posed a reasonable threat to civilian air traffic. The president gave the order to take it down, and we took it down.
It sounds to me, though, that you think that President Biden made this call because of political pressure. Am I reading you right?
Well, I'm trying to, that's what it seems like, Jake, to be candid. I'm trying to understand why this much smaller, by their own admission, much less capable balloon with a much smaller payload was deemed such a threat that the other one wasn't. And it can't just be the altitude. And to your point on, what our red line should be, I guarantee you, if we put an object over Beijing or over some of their sensitive sites at 40 to 60,000 feet for days, collecting sensitive intelligence, they would take action. We need to take reciprocal action and, again, make that clear up front.
Yeah, Senator Marco Rubio, your senator from Florida, said to me on Sunday that if we sent the Goodyear blimp over there, they would shoot it down. Republican Congressman Mike Waltz of Florida, good to have you on. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Christiane, it's been quite a day here. You sat down for an exclusive interview with Lula, but before we get to that, I do want to get your reaction to the news about the Biden administration shooting down another object, this time over the coast, over Alaska somewhere.
Well, look, it does seem extraordinary, and I think what was really extraordinary is that both the White House and the Pentagon had briefings at which they could really tell us nothing. What exactly is this object? We don't know. And we won't know until they retrieve it and bring it to us and tell us what it is. But clearly it's very politicized in this country. Obviously, we know that balloons have flown around this country through previous administrations, and it is a mystery, and it comes at a time. They haven't said whether this is a state-owned object, but the last one they assigned to China, where the relations are so bad that anything like this can potentially cause accidents. And I think it really does go to the point that a country like the United States needs to have better relations with really important countries like China.
Yeah, and the Secretary of Defense, Austin, called his counterpart in China a few days ago, and they didn't take the call.
Exactly.
Let's go to your interview with Lula now, who has adopted a policy of non-intervention when it comes to the Ukraine